Douglas did not understand when the weight of the secret first began to crush him. At the beginning, it felt like a strange pressure behind his eyes, a tightness in his chest that came and went without warning, something that made it hard to breathe when he tried to sleep. He told himself that adults carried secrets all the time, that maybe this was just part of growing up, but the difference was that this secret did not stay still. It moved inside him, shifted with every memory of his father's tired smile, every moment Thomas pretended nothing was wrong, every time Douglas caught him staring too long into space, as if he were memorizing the world. The secret grew heavier each day, until it no longer felt like something Douglas was holding, but something that was holding him hostage. He had not meant to overhear the conversation. It happened by accident, the way the most devastating truths often do. Thomas had been on the phone in a quiet corner of the house, his voice low, controlled, stripped of the performative confidence Douglas was used to hearing. Douglas had paused at the top of the stairs, about to call out to his father, when the words drifted upward and froze him in place. He did not understand everything at first, only fragments that sounded too serious to ignore. No more treatment, weeks, not months, quality of life. The doctor's voice came through faintly, but Thomas's responses were devastatingly clear.
He was calm. Too calm.
He asked practical questions, spoke about arrangements, about making sure Douglas would be okay. It was only when Thomas's voice cracked, just once, barely audible, that Douglas realized this was not an ordinary conversation. This was goodbye disguised as logistics. From that moment on, Douglas lived in two worlds. In one, Thomas was still his father, present, attentive, protective, insisting on normal routines, movie nights, quiet dinners, gentle conversations about school and friends. In the other world, the one Douglas carried alone, Thomas was a man counting down his days, pretending strength while his body betrayed him piece by piece. Douglas watched more closely than ever before, noticing things he might have missed otherwise. The way Thomas winced when he stood too quickly, how his hands sometimes trembled, how exhaustion settled over him like a second skin by late afternoon. Each observation felt like confirmation, tightening the knot of fear and grief inside the boy's chest. Douglas tried to keep the secret, tried to honor what he believed was his father's unspoken wish for silence. But silence proved unbearable. It distorted everything, turning ordinary moments into painful reminders of time slipping away. When Thomas smiled at him, Douglas wondered how many smiles were left. When Thomas hugged him, Douglas clung a little longer, afraid that one day there would be no arms to return the embrace. The strain began to show in ways Douglas could not control. He became withdrawn, distracted, anxious, his emotions swinging unpredictably between anger and sadness. Adults noticed, asked questions, but Douglas deflected, unsure how to articulate a truth that felt too big for words. Hope sensed that something was wrong long before Douglas found the courage to come to her. She had learned, through years of loving and losing, that children often carried pain quietly, expressing it through behavior rather than confession. She noticed the way Douglas watched Thomas with an intensity that bordered on fear, the way his eyes filled with tears at unexpected moments, the way he seemed perpetually on edge. Hope assumed, at first, that it was the tension between her and Thomas that was affecting him, the ongoing conflicts and unresolved wounds that had defined their relationship for so long. The guilt of that possibility weighed heavily on her, but she had no idea how much deeper the truth went. The moment Douglas finally broke came, without warning. He showed up at Hope's door late in the afternoon, his face pale, his small body trembling as if he had run all the way there without stopping. When Hope opened the door and saw him standing there, eyes wide with panic, something in her heart dropped instantly. Before she could ask what was wrong, Douglas burst into tears, the kind that came from a place beyond ordinary sadness. Hope pulled him inside, holding him tightly, murmuring reassurances that felt inadequate even as she spoke them. She led him to the couch, sat beside him, and waited, knowing instinctively that whatever he needed to say could not be rushed. When Douglas finally spoke, the words came out in fragments at first, tangled with sobs and gasps for air. He told her about the phone call, about the doctor, about the words he didn't fully understand but somehow knew were terrible. He told her that Thomas was sick, very sick, and that the doctors said there was nothing more they could do. When he said the words, "only a few weeks," his voice broke completely, and Hope felt as though the ground beneath her had vanished. She stared at him in stunned silence, her mind refusing to accept what she was hearing even as her heart recognized the truth in his terror. Hope's shock was immediate and paralyzing. For a moment, she could not speak, could not breathe, could not think beyond the echo of Douglas's words reverberating in her head. Thomas. Terminal cancer. Weeks to live. The ideas collided violently with every recent argument, every accusation, every moment of resentment she had allowed herself to feel. Her chest tightened painfully as guilt surged through her, sharp and unforgiving. She thought of the meetings at Forrester, the tension, the anger she had directed at Thomas, without knowing what he was carrying. The realization that she had been fighting a man who was quietly preparing to die felt unbearable. As Douglas clung to her, seeking comfort she barely felt capable of giving, Hope's emotions twisted into something raw and volatile. There was heartbreak, yes, but also anger. Anger at Thomas for keeping such a devastating truth hidden, anger at the universe for its cruelty, anger at herself for not seeing the signs sooner. Most of all, there was fear. Fear of what this would mean for Douglas, for herself, for a family already fractured by years of pain. She promised Douglas that she would talk to Thomas, that she would find out the truth directly, that he would not be alone with this secret anymore. It was a promise born of desperation as much as love. Facing Thomas was one of the hardest things Hope had ever done. By the time she arrived at his place, her emotions were a tangled mess of sorrow, rage, regret, and dread. She found him sitting quietly, looking thinner than she remembered, the lines on his face deeper, his posture subtly guarded as if holding himself together required conscious effort. For a fleeting moment, she considered saying nothing, simply sitting with him, preserving the fragile normalcy he had worked so hard to maintain. But Douglas's tear-streaked face flashed in her mind, and she knew she could not remain silent. She confronted him without preamble, her voice trembling despite her attempt at composure. She told him what Douglas had heard, demanded to know if it was true. There was no accusation in her tone, only a desperate need for confirmation, for something solid to grasp amid the chaos. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and in that silence, Hope felt her heart shatter piece by piece. When he finally spoke, it was with a quiet resignation that answered her question more clearly than words ever could. Thomas did not deny it. He did not deflect or minimize the truth. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if releasing a burden he had been carrying alone for far too long. He admitted that he was dying, that the cancer was aggressive and unresponsive to treatment, that the doctors had given him weeks, perhaps a little longer if he was lucky. As he spoke, his voice remained steady, but Hope could see the effort it took, the toll the illness had taken on his strength. He looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, as if his spirit itself was worn thin. Hope's reaction was visceral. Tears streamed down her face as she listened, her hands clenched tightly in her lap to keep from reaching out and shaking him, screaming at him, begging him to explain why he had done this alone. She demanded to know why he hadn't told anyone, why he had let Douglas carry such a terrifying truth without support, why he had allowed conflicts and misunderstandings to continue when time was so painfully limited. Her words spilled out in a rush, fueled by grief and fury, each question sharper than the last. Thomas listened without interruption. When she finally ran out of words, he spoke softly, his exhaustion unmistakable. He told her that he hadn't wanted pity, hadn't wanted to be treated like a dying man rather than a father, a son, a designer, a human being with agency. He explained that he had spent so much of his life defined by his worst moments, by people's expectations and judgments, that the idea of being reduced to his illness felt unbearable. He wanted his remaining time to be as normal as possible, to be spent creating memories rather than managing other people's grief. Most of all, he said, he wanted to protect Douglas. He believed, wrongly as he now understood, that shielding his son from the truth would spare him pain. He wanted to be present, to laugh with him, to guide him, to leave behind memories of love rather than fear. Returning to Los Angeles, Thomas explained, had never been about redemption or career ambition. It had been about coming home to say goodbye, to be surrounded by family, to let his son know, in 1,000 small ways, that he was loved beyond measure. Hope's anger softened into something far more painful as she absorbed his words. She saw now how deeply flawed and human his choices had been, born not of manipulation or selfishness, but of fear and love twisted together. The knowledge did not erase the hurt, but it reframed it, transforming her rage into sorrow so profound it left her breathless. She thought of Douglas again, of the impossible position he had been placed in, and felt a renewed surge of determination. Whatever time remained, it could not be spent in silence and isolation. In that moment, the long history between Hope and Thomas, every betrayal, every reconciliation, every unresolved wound, faded into the background. What remained was the raw reality of loss approaching too quickly, too cruelly. Hope realized that forgiveness, if it was to come at all, would not arrive as a grand declaration. It would arrive in actions, in presence, in choosing compassion over resentment in the face of unimaginable grief. As Thomas's strength faltered and the truth settled between them, Hope reached out, not to absolve him or excuse his mistakes, but to acknowledge the shared pain they now carried. The future loomed uncertain and heartbreaking, but one thing was clear. The days ahead would be defined not by secrets and conflict, but by honesty, love, and the fragile, urgent need to make every remaining moment count. The truth about Thomas did not arrive as a single moment, but as a rupture that tore through the Forrester family in widening waves, leaving nothing untouched in its wake. Once the secret slipped beyond the fragile circle Thomas had tried to contain, it spread with devastating speed, carried not by gossip or malice, but by the unbearable necessity of honesty. When Ridge heard the words spoken aloud, that his son was dying, that the illness was terminal, that time had narrowed to weeks rather than years, his world collapsed inward with a violence he had not felt since his own youth. For a man who had spent his life shaping reality through willpower, design, and dominance, there was nothing more annihilating than the realization that he had missed something this enormous, this fatal, in his own child. Ridge did not cry at first. He went still, frighteningly so, as if his body had not yet caught up to the meaning of what his mind had just been forced to absorb. His thoughts raced backward through years of memory, searching obsessively for signs he should have seen, moments he should have questioned. He remembered Thomas's recent return to Los Angeles, the quiet determination in his voice, the way he had spoken about family with an urgency that now seemed painfully obvious. He remembered dismissing fatigue as stress, thinness as discipline, distance as emotional guardedness. Each recollection became an accusation, and the weight of it bent Ridge under a guilt so profound it stole his breath. When the emotion finally broke through, it was raw and uncontained. Ridge wept not only for the son he was about to lose, but for the father he feared he had failed to be. He had built an empire around creativity and legacy, around the idea that what he made would outlive him, yet now the most important legacy of all, his child, was slipping beyond his reach. The knowledge that Thomas had carried this alone, that he had chosen silence rather than risk pity or intervention, devastated Ridge in a way no professional failure ever could. He wondered how many times Thomas had looked at him, knowing the truth, and chosen not to speak. That unspoken distance haunted him, transforming ordinary memories into unbearable reminders of lost chances. Steffi received the news with a shock that cut through her like ice. For all her strength, for all her resilience, she was unprepared for the cruelty of this revelation. Her immediate reaction was disbelief, a reflexive rejection of a reality too painful to accept. Thomas dying. Her brother, her fiercest ally, the person she had defended against the world again and again. The words echoed in her mind without meaning, as if repetition alone might make them false. But when disbelief gave way to certainty, Steffi's composure shattered. She thought of every argument they had shared, every harsh word exchanged in recent weeks over Forrester creations, over leadership, over trust and accountability. She remembered pushing him, challenging him, demanding more when he had already been giving everything he had left. The realization that Thomas had been fighting a losing battle with his own body while still showing up, still trying to prove himself, broke something inside her. Guilt flooded her with relentless force, intertwining with grief until she could no longer separate one from the other. She replayed their last confrontation in her mind, wishing desperately she could take it back, wishing she had seen beyond her frustration to the truth he was hiding. For Steffi, the pain was sharpened by helplessness. She was pregnant, already navigating her own vulnerability, already being asked to choose between family and career, and now this. The timing felt cruelly ironic, as if life itself were testing the limits of her endurance. She wanted to be strong for Thomas, for Ridge, for Douglas, but she felt herself unraveling, the weight of regret pressing down on her with suffocating intensity. She had always believed in facing problems head-on, yet this was something no amount of strength could fix. Liam's reaction stood apart from the immediate devastation felt by the rest of the family, shaped by years of mistrust and conflict that refused to dissolve simply because circumstances had changed. When he first heard about Thomas's illness, skepticism rose instinctively, a defense mechanism honed through painful experience. He had seen Thomas manipulate narratives before, weaponize vulnerability to gain sympathy and control, particularly where hope was concerned. The idea that this could be another elaborate scheme, another attempt to pull hope back into emotional chaos, seemed disturbingly plausible to him in those first moments. Liam voiced his doubts cautiously at first, framing them as concern rather than accusation, but the underlying suspicion was unmistakable. He questioned the timing, the secrecy, the suddenness of the revelation. To him, it felt too catastrophic, too conveniently devastating, as if designed to silence criticism and force forgiveness. His protective instincts toward Hope flared, fueled by fear that she was once again being drawn into Thomas's orbit at the expense of her own peace. Hope's response to Liam's doubts was immediate and unyielding. She did not argue with anger, but with a firmness born of certainty. She told him what Douglas had seen, what Thomas had admitted, the exhaustion in his voice, the resignation in his eyes. Douglas, she insisted, was not confused, not exaggerating, not being manipulated. He was terrified, grieving, and painfully aware of a truth no child should have to carry alone. The intensity of Hope's conviction shook Liam, forcing him to confront the possibility that his skepticism was not caution, but fear of being wrong, fear of facing a reality that demanded empathy rather than control. Douglas's quiet insistence ultimately dismantled what remained of Liam's disbelief. The child's grief was not performative, not strategic. It was raw, unfiltered, devastating in its authenticity. Watching Douglas cling to Hope, hearing him speak of his father with a mix of love and dread, Liam felt his resistance crumble. The possibility that this was a lie dissolved in the face of a child's pain too real to fake. In its place came a different kind of fear, one far more unsettling. The fear that he had misjudged Thomas at the worst possible moment. As Liam's skepticism gave way to concern, it carried with it a complicated sense of shame. He wondered how many times he had assumed the worst, how often his own history with Thomas had blinded him to the possibility of genuine suffering. The realization did not erase the past, did not magically heal old wounds, but it forced Liam to confront the limitations of his perspective. For the first time, he considered the possibility that Thomas's return to Los Angeles had not been about manipulation or redemption, but about farewell. Brooke's reaction unfolded along a different emotional trajectory, shaped by a lifetime of loving the Forrester family in all its flawed complexity. When Hope told her the truth, Brooke did not hesitate to believe it. She had seen enough of life's cruelty to know that tragedy rarely announced itself politely, rarely waited for relationships to be stable or conflicts to be resolved. Her heart broke immediately for Thomas, for Douglas, for Ridge, and even for herself, as memories of past struggles resurfaced with painful clarity. Brooke mourned not only the impending loss of Thomas, but the loss of what might have been. Their relationship had been fraught, marked by mistrust, disappointment, and moments of genuine connection that never fully healed the deeper fractures. Yet beneath it all, Thomas had always been part of her extended family, a boy she had watched grow up, stumble, and fight his way back again and again. The thought that his life was ending just as he seemed poised to find some measure of peace felt unbearably unjust. Her grief was quiet but profound, manifesting in moments of stillness where tears fell without warning, in the way her voice softened whenever Thomas's name was spoken. She felt an acute sorrow for Douglas, whose innocence had been shattered too soon, and for Ridge, whose strength was being tested in ways no man should endure. Brooke did not dwell on past conflicts or resentments. They felt insignificant now, stripped of their power by the finality of what lay ahead. As the family absorbed the truth collectively, the atmosphere shifted in subtle but irreversible ways. Conversations slowed, voices lowered, and priorities reordered themselves around an unspoken understanding that time was now the most precious and unforgiving currency. Old arguments felt hollow, their urgency eclipsed by the reality of loss approaching with relentless certainty. Yet the pain did not erase tension entirely. It transformed it, infusing every interaction with layers of regret, love, and unresolved emotion. Ridge's interactions with Thomas became charged with urgency and sorrow. He oscillated between fierce determination to make the most of the time they had left and paralyzing grief that threatened to overwhelm him. He apologized repeatedly, sometimes aloud, sometimes in the silence of shared space, for not seeing, not knowing, not doing more. Thomas listened with a mixture of gratitude and sadness, assuring his father that blame was unnecessary, that this was not something anyone could have prevented. Yet Ridge could not release the guilt. It had woven itself too tightly into his sense of identity as a father. Steffi, torn between protecting her own fragile stability and being present for her brother, found herself confronting a depth of vulnerability she had long suppressed. She softened toward Thomas in ways that surprised even her, choosing gentleness over confrontation, presence over control. In quiet moments, she spoke to him not as a co-executive or defender, but as a sister who loved him fiercely and feared the future without him. Her regret remained, but it began to coexist with a determination to ensure that the days ahead were not defined by conflict or silence. Hope's role shifted as well, her grief intertwined with a growing resolve to prioritize compassion over resentment. She struggled with guilt for the anger she had directed at Thomas before knowing the truth, yet she refused to let that guilt immobilize her. Instead, she focused on Douglas, on creating a sense of stability and honesty in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly uncertain. She also found herself reevaluating Thomas through a lens she had never allowed before, seeing not just the man who had hurt her, but the father who was desperately trying to leave his son with memories of love rather than fear. Liam watched these changes with a complex mix of emotions. His concern for Hope remained paramount, but it was now tempered by an awareness of his own limitations, of how easily certainty could become blindness. He struggled with the discomfort of being wrong, with the realization that his instinct to protect could sometimes manifest as control or dismissal. As worry replaced suspicion, he began to consider how to support Hope not by shielding her from pain, but by standing beside her as she faced it. The truth about Thomas did not resolve the family's conflicts, it reframed them. It stripped away illusions of permanence and forced each person to confront what truly mattered. Power struggles, professional rivalries, and old grudges were not erased, but they were diminished, rendered fragile in the shadow of mortality. The Forrester family found themselves united not by agreement, but by grief, by love complicated and imperfect, by the shared understanding that time was slipping away far too quickly. As days passed, The weight of what was coming settled into a constant, aching presence. Each interaction carried a sense of urgency, each moment tinged with the knowledge that it might not be repeated. For Ridge, Steffi, Hope, Brooke, Liam, and most of all Douglas, the truth about Thomas became a catalyst for reckoning, forcing them to confront not only the loss ahead, but the choices they had made in the past and the kind of people they wanted to be in the time that remained. In the end, Thomas's illness did not bring clarity so much as it brought honesty. It exposed the raw edges of love and regret, the fragility beneath strength, the cost of silence, and the power of compassion when certainty falls apart. And as the family stood on the edge of an inevitable goodbye, they were left with a single, devastating truth: that understanding, however profound, often arrives too late, and that what matters most is not the perfection of relationships, but the willingness to show up, fully and honestly, before time runs out.
Oh.